Hey, it's time for another video. I just wanted to share a few little stories with you guys. I have spent a lot of time, anytime you work a long time in a shop, you remember funny little jobs and stories and people. And there's a lot of people I remember that I hadn't, probably will get left out of this video, but I wanted to hit you with this stuff and just have a good time today. And this right here was what I would do when somebody kept borrowing my gasket glue. You can see the picture there. What I would do is I would take an old oil can. We were using round oil cans then, except I said Motorcraft on them instead of Quaker State. I still got that bottle of oil out in the garage. And I would take it and I'd cut the bottom out of it. And I would set it over my gasket glue to camouflage it, so that whenever somebody came up, all they saw was a little nasty oil can sitting there. That way they wouldn't steal my stuff, which was pretty funny. And it worked. I mean, if it works, then it doesn't hurt anybody. Why not go ahead and do it? I also did that with my carburetor tune-up cleaner. I would take carburetor tune-up cleaner and I would make a paper label and I would write liquid manure on it or something like that. And if they walked by there and they didn't recognize the label, they wouldn't grab my carburetor or, tune-up cleaner and run off with it. This is the way the shop was laid out. The write-up area was here. My two bays at the time was here. I actually moved deeper into the shop later because I was using the SBDS machine and they didn't want to have it get too much dust on it. And the cars would come in the service gate and go here and they'd park in the service lot. And that's where we would go. A bunch of other service bays were down that way. I didn't take the trouble to draw that. Now, this was David, me, Little Mark, Big Mark, and there's some other people I don't have pictured here that I'm going to be talking about. All right, the service department, the way it was laid out was the write-up area was here. You'd park on the service lot. There's a big door down at the end, and it would let people in. Then these guys would park here, and we would come in from the outside. Okay, this first story I'm going to tell you is about Little Mark, he actually was a record driver, but he was also something of a mechanic. He worked with me over there. And Little Mark worked here. My two bays were right here at the time. The front end guy, he worked in these two bays. Big Mark worked here. And the service riders area was out here. There was 4 service riders. So one day, Mark had changed his radio station and he had really loud music going. And I mean, it was just, you ever have another mechanic working in the next service bay that's playing music so loud it's just driving you nuts? And that's what he was doing. And so I says, Mark, you need to turn that music down because it's driving me crazy. And he says, and of course he raises his nose and gets in my face and he goes, I like that radio station and I'm not changing it. And I said, okay. It was cold like it is, in the wintertime. The doors were all down, so we'd bring a car in, we'd pull the door down so it would stay warm in there. But I'm kind of hot-natured anyway, and I almost never wore a coat. And so I went ahead and raised both of my service bay doors, and I just left them up. And so he's walking around shivering over there, and he comes over there and he goes, pull those doors down. I'm freezing over here. And I says, I like those doors up, and I'm not letting them down. And he goes, oh, okay, I get it, I can handle this. And so he walked around shivering for a while, and then he came over there with his face all red and his veins bulging in his neck. And he says, okay, I'll change the radio station, but it's not because you got the door up. Don't put that door down. And so anyway, I put the doors down and he changed the radio station. There's ways to make things happen like that. Well, I'm working on a Bronco too. Big Mark was, and he saw a rat under there. And so it startled him, and he got out of the way, and the rat ran off, and he couldn't see it anywhere. So he reached it down here by the fender to get something, reached down there, checked oxygen sensor ground or whatever he was doing. And another Philip guy named Philip Kirkland came walking up, and he reached through the wheel well and grabbed his hand all over Mark's arm. And after having seen that rat, Mark was so scared he made a lot of funny noises and skinned his knuckles trying to jerk his hand back out of there. But anyway, David took me to his mother's house one night to check on her dogs and stuff because she was gone out of town or something. And he goes to leave me, like whenever I got out to close the gate, he goes to drive off. So when he started pulling, he turned around right down this road and came back up there to turn into the driveway. But I ran over here and kept this tree between me and him so he couldn't see me. He got rattled. There was a car that came up behind him wanting to get by, and he missed the turn, and his left front wheel of the Mustang went off in the ditch, and the back wheels were just spinning in the air. And when I went running over there to see what we could do to get that out of there, he jumped out of the car and said, "I hope you're satisfied." That wasn't a service-based story, but it was a funny thing that happened. Philip, a shop foreman, he looked like Slim Pickens to me and talked like him too, except he was shorter. But he was a little bit annoying sometimes. He came out of the 60s. He would get bored and would like to argue. And he was really afraid of snakes. Anytime anybody wanted him to think there was a snake around, he would react to that. He was in the parts room one day waving his arms around telling about how his dogs had got into a nest of water moccasins down going across the creek. And I went out to my toolbox and I got a piece of hose and slid it over his shoulder, and I thought he was going to do a backflip right there in the parts room. But he would be out in the middle of the shop and he'd be looking around to see what everybody was doing. A lot of the time the shop foreman, bless their heart, they don't have anything to do and they're bored. And so they want to go over here and start discussions and arguments. Some of them do. That's the way he was. And he would come over there to me. I was working on a little LTD one day and setting the car, wet float level on that Motorcraft 2150 carburetor. And he was saying, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm setting the float level on this carburetor, the wet float level." And he said, "Set it on 3/4 of an inch, from the top of the plate, the fuel level." I said, "No, you can't do that. This one here, the deck where the interior is bolted on is lower than that, and it'll flood if you set it on 3/4. And so, anyway, he says, no, and he wanted to argue, and I knew it was going to, be a pain to deal with. And I noticed a little vacuum diaphragm over there that opened up the early fuel evaporation passage, So when the heat riser was closed, and it would actually open up that little diaphragm, which was a still unusual thing, but it was on those 3.8 liters. And it would let, I say, "Philip, that doesn't apply to this one because it's got an exhaust heat riser and an exhaust heat control valve," which confused him because he wasn't sure what I was talking about. And so he wandered off and left me alone that day. But I had a lot of adventures with that guy. The K cars, these K cars, you might remember these K cars. We had a GTE contract, and a lot of these K cars we had to work on. We had no shop manuals or anything, but we were expected to figure out what was wrong with these and fix them. And they had that funky little carburetor on them. And those darn things, when the AC would kick on, they would idle rough and all that. Some of y'all might have seen that back in the day. And what I kind of figured out, I talked to a guy that I was at school with up in Atlanta and got some ideas from him. But I took the oxygen sensor lead and went into it with my meter. And I was reading that voltage on that oxygen sensor, watching it switch. And when the AC would kick on, that voltage would drop to nothing, and the engine would try to stall. But I got my little can of carburetor spray with a little snout, and every time that would happen, I would shoot a little carburetor spray right at the base, I had a little pipe on it, right at the base of the carburetor when that happened, and that would cause the oxygen sensor to normalize and it wouldn't stall. And so after that, I pulled the carburetor off, and I would, blow all the gas out of it, because you can't turn a carburetor upside down with a bunch of gas in it, or sediment will get up in all the passages, and you won't be able. You'll have to rebuild it. But I would blow all the gas out of the bowl with a blower, turn it over, and then I flat filed the bottom of that carburetor. And it was getting shiny on the ends. It was a long, skinny thing with holes in the corners. And when I flat filed that thing so that it wasn't, you couldn't look at it until it had a dip to it. But I flat filed it and put it back on there, and that thing ran like a brand new car. That was very difficult to troubleshoot. Of course, on those you didn't have any way of pulling codes or nothing like that, back in the 80s. And so the shop foreman was totally amazed at that. Prior to that, I had seen one of these carburetors. I don't know if you guys have run into this before, but whenever you hit the gas, it closed the choke. And when it closed the choke, you'd crank it up, and it would open the choke a little bit, but the fast, it'd be on fast idle for about a minute and a half or so, and then the choke would come wide open. Well, this particular one, when I noticed when you gassed it, that spring, that spiral spring in there, that bimetal spring, wasn't strong enough to hold the choke, and it would pull it open, and then the fast idle cam with that little sawtooth design it had would catch that thing and hold the choke too far open, and the engine would stall. And I'd seen that on other carburetors. It was fairly common whenever that spring needed to be adjusted. Well, on this one, there were rivets holding the dadgum choke spring cap on there. And I drilled them out, and I was going to go ahead and put a little more tension on that thing and put screws in there. And the shop foreman comes walking up, and now you got to remember, he came out of the 1960s when if you knew what was wrong with any car, you knew what was wrong with all cars most of the time, and they only gave 3 or 4 problems. That was in his mind anyway. He had the idea that if you got a handle on whatever was making certain things happen, you pretty well had the key to fixing just about every car that came in. Well, those days were long gone, but he didn't realize it because he had been a shop foreman so long he hadn't actually been, had his wrenches in his hands working on a vehicle that he was responsible for years. And I'm not trying to tear the guy down. I really like him. He died not long ago. He was 18 years older than me. But anyhow, he came over and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm adjusting the choke," and I explained to him why. He says, "You're wasting your time. That's not going to fix that. We've only had 2 problems with these cars. We've had carbon in the cylinder head and timing belt issues." And I said, "Well, one way or another, I'm going to have to put all this stuff back together before we can test drive it. And if you don't like the way it runs, then I'll work on it some more." And so I went ahead and put it all back together, and I could tell it was fixed, because it had cooled off by that time, and it didn't do that anymore. And I parked it outside, turned the ticket into dispatch. Dispatch handed it to him for a test drive. He went and test drove it, brought it back, parked it, gave it back. He test drove it 4 times after letting it get cold, and I overheard him telling the dispatcher that he still wasn't satisfied with it, but he couldn't find anything wrong with the way it ran. It was one of those funny little situations there. That's kind of the way he was put together again. But another one, I had a 7.3 power stroke that came in there, and they're supposed to have 55 to 80 pounds of fuel pressure. This was a hard start. And so when I checked the fuel pressure with that special adapter and other gauge, the gauge, it had only like 20 pounds of fuel pressure. And so I told him, I said, this one's going to have a fuel pump. It had a mechanical fuel pump down in the valley, but in the behind the fuel filter housing. And he said, "Well," he said, "you've got too much drivability work to do. I'm going to let Eddie, the line guy, put this pump on there." So Eddie puts the pump on there, and then the thing's blowing white smoke everywhere when he's trying to start it, and it won't start. And so I just stayed out of the way. Well, the shop foreman fought with it for a while. I thought he was going to burn the starter up on that truck. He came over and said, "What do you think's wrong with this diesel over here? It won't start after we put the fuel pump on it." I said, "It's probably flooded." He goes, No. I said, yeah, you can flood a diesel. "No, you can't flood no diesel." He went back over there, and they fought with it for another 30 minutes. And then he came back and said, "Can you come over here and see if you can figure this thing out?" Well, I looked at the new generation star tester, and when you went to start it, the control pressure went up to like 3,500 pounds. Because he had actually adaptive learning. When it was starting hard, it kept ratcheting that pressure up, and it learned a much higher value to get it started as quick as possible when it had low fuel pressure. When it had the proper fuel pressure, that was too much. And I told the mechanic that had been working, I said, "Pull all the battery cables off." So he pulled the battery cable off, the 2 positive cables. So he pulled those off, and so the shop foreman said, "Hey, tell me again how you can flood a diesel." I said, "Well, if you get too much fuel in there, it cools it down, it won't fire, and then all that fuel just goes out the back and white smoke." And no, he was just not convinced. And I told Eddie, I said, "Put battery cables back on." When he put the battery cables back on, you could breathe on that key and that thing would fire up. And after it fired up and was running, he was still shaking his head saying, no. He couldn't accept that. That was funny. Well, me and the foreman of this Eagle Summit, Eagle Summits were brand new back then. They came out in '89, and we were working on the one that came in, and the customer said that they saw a little surge in the tack. They couldn't feel it, they could just see it. And then they got to where they could feel the surge. And so they brought it in, and I looked at that thing, and I worked on it, and I fooled with it, and I checked EGR and all that stuff. And finally I hooked an injector cleaning machine up to it with some adapters I built, and I cleaned the injectors. And that cleared that up. I drove it, it was smooth, there was no wiggling on the tack. 2 days later, they're back with the same problem. So they came back, and he says, "Well, take that other new Summit out there that's on the lot. I'm going to swap the injectors out." Because, we were fooled into thinking the injectors were the problem because cleaning them had taken care of that one. So I did that. That took care of it for another 2 days. It came back again. Well, I got my dwell meter, little dwell meter with a needle on it, hooked it up to the torque converter clutch. I don't even remember why I did that, unless I noticed that the surge went away when I tapped the brake or something. I don't, I've slept since then. That was back in 1989. But anyway, when I noticed that this was a modulated torque converter, I didn't see anything in the book that talked about that at the time. And so we called this Dave Farley guy from down there in New Orleans at Chrysler, and he said to change the transmission fluid and put Mopar plus 4 in there, which had a friction modifier in it basically. And to start with, we were laughing at that because we didn't think that was going to do nothing. But when we changed that fluid, that fixed that car. And later on, because of that experience, I fixed some Tauruses that were doing a surge that felt like an EGR surge, that when the torque converter was modulating, it was supposed to have a smooth, calibrated slip. Some of your Crown Victorias will feel like you're running over those little speed breakers going to a stop sign, boom, and that's because of chattering torque converter clutch. But this Taurus was surging, and I actually got some of that stinking friction modifier like you're supposed to put in those Ford rear ends for the limited slip. I poured some of that in the transmission, took care of the whole problem. Didn't do that anymore. Of course, the engineer said, no, don't ever do that. Well, if you smell that fluid now, it's for those with modulated torque converters. It smells, it's like it's got that same friction modifier in it, which that was just, something I kind of figured out on the fly. That I monitored the torque converter so long with an old well meter, and thought, why did the injectors fix the problem for a couple of days each time? So we put this in Mopar plus 4 in it, and it took care of that surge. There was another guy that also had a Eagle Talon he was working on. He brought it in with a surge like that. And I went and looked, and we had serviced a transmission that one of our guys did. He put the wrong fluid in it. And so I was able to figure that one out really quick for that reason. This big Mark was in the right-up area. This guy pulls the truck in. He says he's hearing the same radio station. In other words, he's hearing the radio keep playing when he switches off the truck. Mark goes out there and finds a boom box behind the seat. It's on the same station. And apparently when the guy leaned back, he accidentally turned the boom box on, and so he thought his truck radio was playing all the time. That was kind of a funny story there too. On this one here, the guy comes in on a Mustang, and there's no static that day. Static is on a cold, dry day usually. This one here, what it did was, he said, when me or my wife gets out of the car, it shocks us. When we get out, we standing on the ground and we touch the door, it shocks. And I was thinking, this is not even a day for static. And so I got in the car, got out, and it didn't shock me. He got in the car, got out, and I heard it pop a little bit when he touched the door, and I said, well, that's really interesting. I said, I tell you what, I says, what I want you to do is get out of the car, I'll hold on to the door, and you touch me. And boy, whenever he did that, it felt like I'd been hit by a coil on plug or something. I mean, it was just like knocked me down. It was a spark. I bet it jumped an inch when it hit me. I had no earthly idea why that was happening to him and his wife both. Yeah, it wouldn't shock me, but it would shock me, me through him. Just incredible. It was probably somebody's body chemistry. I told him to get some of that anti-static spray and spray on the seat. That typically works, but my goodness, what a mess that was. But, I don't know what you mean. Some of the people used to have these ground straps on their cars where it would drag along and keep the car grounded all the time. Have you ever seen those? That was back in the era of curb feelers and silly things people used to have. But anyway, this one right here, this was kind of funny. I was standing way over here talking to some guys. The shop foreman was walking over here, and he was checking all these doors going down there to the shop. And up in the top of the shop, there was all this duct work and all these wires and all this kind of stuff. It was just a big, mesh of stuff up there in the top of the shop like you see in a big building like that. And I tied a shop rag up in a tight ball, where you can throw it. And I told them guys I was talking to, I said, I'm going to throw this shop rag and I'm going to bounce it right off the shop foreman's head. And I just kind of threw that thing at random in his direction, and it cleared every bit of that stuff up there. It didn't touch a single wire or light or piece of ductwork or anything. It bounced right off the back of his head. If I'd have been paid to do that, there's no way on earth I could have done it. He just laughed at me and turned around, But that was that. It was a long way too. I must have thrown that thing 100 yards, or it felt like it anyway. All right, so me and him were driving a Bronco too. My watch beeped. I had a watch that would beep every hour. And about the time my watch beeped, he saw a police car come over the hill. He said, he must have a radar detector in here. I said, no, that was my watch. He goes, you got a radar detector on your watch? You know? There was another time, this drop light, he had his drop light up there still, although he never used it much, but he had his toolbox and his drop light there. And the dispatcher ran out of drop light bulbs. That's what we use, the old incandescent ones, you know. And so I went up there to get a bulb for my light because it was blown. And he goes, I don't have any of those bulbs. You have to, you know, figure out some other way to do it. Use a flashlight or something. So I was over there, and he comes over there, the shop foreman does, and he says, did you take the bulb out of my drop light? And he was pointing at the light that was in the bulb that was in my light. And I said, no, that bulb's blown, and Dennis doesn't have any light. Somebody had stole the bulb out of his drop light. And he was hot about it, because he'd had it a long time. He felt like that was a perfect bulb. And somebody took his bulb. And he said, well, somebody took the bulb out of my drop light, and it looked just like that bulb there. And I thought, really? I mean, bulbs all look alike. There was a guy brought a Mustang in there, a beautifully restored '66 Mustang with a 289, and it had a, I don't remember if it, I think it was a 3 on the floor, 4 on the floor or something. I don't remember what transmission was in it, but I do remember it was a stick, and he wanted the best tune-up we could give him, the very best one, the best tune-up, you know. And so I went ahead and put points and plugs in it, set the timing like I would any other vehicle. The plugs looked like they were brand new. And so I test drove it. You know, whenever you're driving a car that's so pristine as that, you just drive it real careful, which I did. But when the shop foreman went riding it with the guy, after he brought it back and said it wasn't fixed, he rode with a guy, and that guy was tacking it up to about 6,000 or 7,000 RPM, or practically the place where you're going to blow it up. And he was feeling it cut out just a little bit. And it turned out, you know how those plug wires go down into those boots? I hooked up the interrogator, that Sun interrogator machine you see there. We had one of those at the time, and I was the only one that used it. It was really, there was some cool stuff it would do, but mostly it was a joke. It was just an expensive toy. It didn't have a true scope on it. Whenever you told it to do a secondary ignition test, it would just give you numbers on the screen, is what it would do. And so anyway, I went by that, and one of them was taking like 20,000 volts to fire. And you know those old boots, how it would go snap down into the distributor cap. He had the plug wire pushed down in there, but it was just riding, you know, about that high above where it was supposed to be snapped in, and it had to jump. And whenever he was, you know, tacking the darn thing out where it was practically about to, you know, redline it and all, he would feel it cut out. And that's what he brought it in there for. He didn't tell us that. He just said he wanted a tune-up. And sometimes they don't give you the information you need, you see. There was a guy one time that brought a Ford Ranger in there. And I don't know if you guys remember this, but back in the mid-'80s, when they first started putting fuel injection on a lot of vehicles, they put these olefins in the fuel. And these olefins they put in the fuel, you know, would basically mix with octane really well and usually stay mostly suspended. And they were little black particles, and what they had to do, they were supposed to go blowing through the injectors along with the fuel and keep the pencils on the injectors clean. Well, they miscalculated that, because what would happen is when the injectors when you shut it off and the injector would quit clicking, it trapped some of that stuff. And it would also, you know, ultimately start to clog the injectors and mess up the spray pattern. But it would also, the olefins would also pile up on the intake valves, very similar to what's going on with GDI vehicles now, you know, the ones that don't have the dual MPI and GDI injectors. And it would be a lot of carbon on those valves. It was really terrible. And so we actually, Ford sent us a walnut hole blaster so we could, you know, pull the injectors out, use a borescope to look, and then go down there and walnut hole blast those valves and make it run like a brand new vehicle again. But as long as those olefins were in there, there was a big problem. And before we ever got the walnut hole blaster, we worked on those Rangers, and it just drove us nuts. Some of the Jeep Cherokees were given the same problem, and Jeep came out with a different engine controller that was supposed to saturate the olefin deposits, you know, which was weird. I mean, it was a strange thing. Anyhow, I actually started cleaning those Jeeps with that walnut hole blaster too. It had a vacuum attachment to pull the walnut holes out while you were vacuuming them in, so they didn't, you know, get in there and fill the cylinders up with walnut holes. So I was, this guy came in there, and one of the things I had done on one of the vehicles was I took a little vacuum restrictor one way, that would, and I put it in the line going to the fuel pressure regulator. For some reason, I was just experimenting to see how much difference that would make. To hold the pressure up a little higher when you give it the gas or whatever, and it didn't really work. And the reason that truck was so as bad as it was it belonged to a security guard, and he would drive it 100 yards, shut it off, drive it 100 yards, shut it off, drive it 100 yards, shut it off, and he clogged those intake ports up so bad that thing would just stumble something awful when it was cold. And then he got rid of the truck, and I didn't know he got rid of the truck, but I had worked on it quite a bit, never successfully till we got our walnut hole blaster. If you pull the head off, did a valve job, it would fix it for a while, but it always came back until they stopped putting those olefins in the fuel. But the point is, this guy came in and he wanted a tune-up. So I said, okay, did a tune-up. That's all he asked for was a tune-up. And his Ranger was like an 86 Ranger. And he came whipping right back in there and said, since you tuned this up, it stumbles when it's cold. And I got to looking at that thing real close, and I noticed back there where you couldn't hardly see it, that vacuum restrictor. I said, I know this truck, and it had this problem before you brought it in here, and you're trying to stick it to us by saying, do me a tune-up, and now I've got a problem. I says, we can work on this truck and fix it, but you're going to pay us, and you're going to pay us good. And that guy just turned really red in the face, and he drove away, and I never saw him again. But sometimes the new customers will do that. They'll try to hang something on you. They don't tell you what the problem is. They just tell you to tune it up so they get their foot in the door. And it always irritates me to see somebody do something like that. All right. This was a big Mark thing. This guy pulled in there with a Bronco 2, and there was smoke coming from under the corner of the hood. And he goes, open the hood, open the hood. They go, open the hood. When he opened the hood, there was flames that came out. He let go of the hood and it slammed. And then he said, open the hood again, open the hood again. But anyway, that was a big engine fire that was going on. As soon as they brought it off the service light, it caught fire. I went out there one day to get a Taurus that I had to do it was a no start. And it was about probably 150, I don't know, 75 yards from the shop or whatever. It's long. It's good ways out there on the service lot. We had a big service lot. Open the hood on that thing. And I'd always taught my students, this is always check spark first, and then check fuel pressure. Don't check fuel pressure and spill a little fuel on the engine and then check spark, which I had followed that procedure this time, but somehow or another, even after I checked the spark and then I checked the fuel pressure, I was spinning it over, and there was a spark somehow that came out of the distributor that caught a little puddle of fuel on fire down there, and that was really scary. And I blew it out and it came back, and I blew it out and it came back, and I blew it out and it came back. I blew myself out of wind blowing that fire out. I couldn't leave it and go to the shop and do anything, or the next thing, burn the car down to the ground. It had come back. How you keep blowing it out and you're frantically afraid, Anyway, that was scary as all get out, and finally I got the fire to stay out. And I never forgot that, and how spooky, how frantic I was at trying to get that fire out. Okay, Philip Kirkland was letting his lift down. He heard this big truck going by behind him when he was letting the lift down. He was working in the stall where little Mark worked a little bit later. And my helper went up behind him with a big air horn hooked up to a air hose. And he says, he's hearing his truck getting closer and closer, but passing by, and I said, look out! And my helper went, wah, blew that air horn right behind him, and his eyes glazed and his knees buckled. I thought he was going to faint. But Mark Van Wagner was a guy that was, I really liked the guy, but he was a little bit slow, but he was really strong and well coordinated with his hands and all. I'm telling you, he looked like a superhero. He had big muscled up, he could have, almost like a cartoon superhero, because he kind of had skinny legs, but he had big shoulders and arms and all. But he drove a little, he called it a moped, but it was really one of the little scooters. And he actually built him a trailer to go behind it. And he was going to, he had a couple of little dogs, and he lived in a trailer, and his dog got in a fight. So he came back on the Monday, and he came over there. He was always talking to me, and he said, my two dogs got in a fight, and the little chow puppy got his face all tore up. And so he says, I loaded him onto my moped, and I took him over to Flowers Hospital to the emergency room. And I said, you took a dog to the emergency room? He says, yeah. And I says, what did they say at the emergency room? He says, they told me they said, you can't bring that dog up here with that moped. And I says, well, what happened then? He says, they called a veterinarian, and he came and sewed up the dog's face and charged me $150. And he says, did I do wrong? I said, well, if you'd have knocked the dog in the head, you'd be $150 richer. I just that guy just totally blew me away. How some of the funny stuff he would do and all that kind of stuff. But little Mark, this is a little Mark story. He says, I can't get this Ranger to idle. And of course, what I always basically did was clean the throttle body and made sure that the idle air control was clean, and then I would unplug the idle air control, and then I would adjust the base idle until it was hovering right there on about 550, and then I would plug it back in. Make sure you don't set the base idle in the dead band where it won't even use the idle air control. Anyway, whenever he got through doing everything I told him to do, he came over there and he goes, hey, what you told me to do worked just fine. You must have seen this before. And I said, nope, never seen one of those. He grabbed me by the throat. Anyway, I had a ton of fun. I got one more guy I want to talk about named Tony. He was one of my favorite people in the whole world, service rider. And me and him were always going on at one another all the time. One day I was raising my door. My door was one of those you had to raise up by hand. It was real big and heavy and tall. And it was aggravating to raise it anyway. And I went to raise it up one day, and I was pulling on that thing, and I got it up about 18 inches off the ground. And I looked over there to the other way, and Tony was standing on the door. But it was amazing to me. I even got it that much off the ground because he weighed about 250 pounds. But anyway, I come back from lunch one day, and he ambushed me with a water pistol. One day I charged up a condenser. That's showing my brother how to charge up a condenser, and I threw it at Tony, and it popped, and he thought he had lost a hand, but and then he came around trying to get everybody else to grab a condenser. Nobody would do it. But he was out there one day. Me and him were always going back and forth doing buying one another Cokes and mug root beers and stuff like that. And I got a Coke one day, and I finished it, and I washed the can out really good, and it was all sweaty and cold, and it looked like it had Coke in it. And I went out there where he was, and I said, I'm going to offer this to you only one time today. And start with, he said he didn't need it because he had a cup of coffee. And then he was a service rider. He worked there with David. But I said, okay. I said, here you go. I'll go ahead and take this, and I won't offer this to you again today. He said, no, wait a minute. And so whenever he tossed off his coffee and he got his mouth ready for that Coke, and he grabbed that can of cold water, and when he turned it up, he jerked it down and he spit all over the wall. If you get your mouth ready for Coke and you're drinking cold water, it really startles you. Well, I got one more story about him. His wife's car was in a body shop, and that's another story in and of itself. So they were a one-car family, and he had to bum rides because she was using his car while her car was in a body shop. And so he wanted to use my little VW diesel Rabbit to go to home to eat lunch with. And I said, you need to put some diesel, $2 worth of diesel in that Rabbit, because you borrowed it too many times and you're burning too much on fuel. Which really wasn't very much, but that's giving him a hard time. He says, oh, I have clearly been used ever since my wife's car has been in the body shop. I have had to buy double cheeseburgers for Bud Wright, $2 worth of diesel, and mug root beers for the house. But he was a memorable guy. He died when he was 50 years old, but he was one of my favorite people. I really enjoyed working with him because he was so funny. One day, David came and told me, he says, do you know what Tony's doing? Tony is telling Eddie, this guy that was the front end man, to punch his card out 20 minutes after he leaves. So that he's taking long lunch hours, and it looks like he's only gone an hour. And he said, that just burns me up because he's cheating me and everybody else and taking long lunch hours and, getting away with it. And I said, that's interesting. Well, I didn't say anything to him about it. But one day Tony came over there because he couldn't find Eddie, and he says, hey, do you mind punching my card out? And before he could say anything else, I said, sure, Tony, no problem. And I ran straight to the time clock and grabbed his card and put it in there and went, poof, there you go, I punched it out for you. How do you think about that? He looked so disgusted and said, oh, thanks. And then he wandered off. But anyway, that's pretty much all I got for you today. And this is just some funny stories I just thought of. These things rotate around in my mind a lot of the times when I'm talking to you guys. I don't usually take the time just to tell funny stories. And I hope this video is not a waste of your time. If it is, I'm sorry, but I enjoyed telling my stories. And so I'll see you guys next time.